Okay, so hello, Jessica. Nice to meet you. Can you,
Hi.
can you tell us a bit about your background and what brought you to write your book, Nervous System Reset?
Sure, I'd love to. So my background goes back about 2 decades, and I first started out with completing a Bachelor of Health Science. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually learning about the vagus nerve's impact on the heart. And then I completed a Master's of Physiotherapy, and I ended up working with a lot of patients who had chronic conditions, and it seemed to present as a cluster. And a lot of the times, what I felt like I was seeing was a little bit like what's above the surface of the water, like an iceberg. And what I knew was that for a lot of people who presented with persistent pain, anxiety, gut issues, that there was a lot going on beneath the surface of the water. So in 2017, I ended up closing my own clinic to spend more time going in to look at this communication between the brain and the body. And at the same time, my brother passed away, which was a big shock for me. So I was personally put into a state of dysregulation that I needed to really learn to walk the talk with the work that I teach. And so I spent about 2 years really going into the vagus nerve and the nervous system.
Mm.
And when I started practicing again, I began to use a lot of education with my patients and running workshops on this. And it really just took off. And my husband said, you need to look at doing this with like a broader audience because lots of people need this help. And so we began teaching the Vagus Nerve Masterclass and the Vagus Nerve program. And that was back in 2018. So it's been 6 years we've been teaching those, and we've helped about 20,000 students now come through the program and the masterclass, which is really fantastic. So we're seeing some great results for the people who study with us using those resources.
That's wonderful. It's a great journey.
Yes.
Um, so what is the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory? Can you give us an overview of that, please?
Yeah, sure. So the vagus nerve we can think of first of all as being that literal connection between the brain and body. I mean, I think a lot of health practitioners, but a lot of us think that they're very separate things. When I think about being a physiotherapist, I might have thought, well, I work on the body. But really, a large part of what I did was communicated with the vagus nerve and the nervous system. And so if we run the hand down the back of our head where the bony ridge meets the neck and went inwards from there, that's where our brainstem is. And so the vagus nerve starts there and then it travels all the way down, touching our heart, going under our diaphragm, and it spreads out like a big vine to touch almost every organ in the abdomen and goes right down to the colon. And most of its communication is actually traveling from the body up to the brain. And so it plays a really important role in threat detection. So that has to do with what we might say is neuroception. Now, we used to just think of the nervous system as this really simple two-branch system. We had the sympathetic or the fight or flight branch, which was like the accelerator. And then we had the parasympathetic or the rest and digest, which was a little bit like a brake. But that model is now outdated. It doesn't explain uh, the full states of our nervous system, and it's not really trauma informed. So we actually know we have two branches of the brake, and one, if we think about this like a car, is the brake that we would use with our foot pedal that gives us like accuracy and slowing down. And so the part of our vagus nerve that runs from our brainstem to our heart, we call the ventral vagal branch. That acts like the brake that we'd use with our foot. And it's covered in a coating that makes the impulses travel really accurately. So, we can let a little bit of the brake off, and then our system is more mobilized to meet challenges and demands, but then we can apply that brake again and slow ourselves back down. But when people are experiencing really high levels of stress and they can't deal with it with the fight or flight branch of the nervous system, which is like the accelerator, we feel that mobilizing energy that moves us towards anxiety or agitation or anger. It's a little bit like we pull the handbrake on, and that's the branch of the vagus nerve that travels from the brainstem more down towards our organs into our belly, called the dorsal vagal branch. That particular part of the vagus nerve doesn't have the coating on it that makes the accurate signals that travel quickly. So it's almost like we pull the handbrake on and we come to a complete stop. So people might know that sense of feeling themselves collapse. They might feel that sense where they cut off from their body. It's related to shame. So we might feel ourselves spiral down into this sense of feeling awful about ourselves, or hear that voice telling us that, our situation's hopeless or we're helpless and there's no point trying. And so that gives us 3 states. We can look at the regulated state that ventral branch of the vagus nerve takes us into. Doesn't mean that we feel perfectly calm all the time, but it does mean that we can handle our emotions and bodily sensations, and we can still act in line with our values or what's important to us. The second state is that sympathetic state, or a state where we feel that mobilizing energy I was talking about. We can be anxious, anger. We can think of that as fight or flight. Then we can have the third state, which is that shutdown state, where we might feel the immobilization, and that's where we feel ourselves collapse and a cutting off from our body. So it's the vagus nerve really is the thing that plays out those states we move into, and it will impact our emotions and our physiology at the same time.
Thank you. And where does that differ, or how is it the same to the theories around window of tolerance? Does it overlap?
It's really similar. Yeah. So we can say that the ventral vagal state is the same as being inside that window of tolerance. And then we can say above the window in hyperarousal is really the same as that sympathetic state. And then being below, or the hypoarousal, is the same as being in that dorsal vagal state. And yeah, people might be familiar with that sense of oscillating between those 3 states.
Thank you. And you talk in the book about how the nervous system has a set point and how this set point can move. Can you explain a bit about that and how it can move and be reset?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of helpful to think about this as a little bit like a thermostat in a house. We might set a temperature in a house that's comfortable for us, and that's like what being regulated is really, and we oscillate around that. So we have times in the day where we have that mobilization, and that's a really good thing. If I'm going to be talking to you, I have that mobilizing energy in my nervous system because I love talking about this. It's my passion. I'm enthusiastic about it. But then afterwards, I would want to be able to bring that energy back down to that set point. And we hear a lot about stress being bad, but stress is really just our brain and our body mobilizing energy to face these challenges, to meet demands. But we have the inbuilt capacity to recover from it and return to our set point. And what we notice can happen is that if we have chronic stress where there's not the opportunity to recover, then we can stay with that mobilizing energy in our system. And it's like the part of the vagus nerve that brings us back to regulation stays off. So, for instance, this was pre-COVID in Australia. We had some bushfires, and then, the people that I was working with or helping, they already had this sense of stress. There was mobilization in their system, and then COVID hit. And for some of them, there were other stresses. So it was like these ongoing waves where their nervous system was in a heightened state. And so it was a little bit like the temperature was turned up on the thermostat, and they didn't get to come back down to that baseline. And that happens because our nervous system isn't passively just receiving information or taking in what's happening. It's actually learning, and it's really reshaping itself to respond to what we experience, our environments, and the relationships we have. And so if we go through something that's really stressful, we might initially be pushed to that hotter state where the temperature comes up, and then we experience what we were saying, the things like anxiety, anger, fight or flight. But it can go the other way. So if we experience something that's more along the lines of traumatic stress, the temperature may move to be too hot, but usually there's a dorsal vagal component or a part of that shutdown component that comes with traumatic stress. And so we might move down, like the thermostat's been turned down too cold. And then that would bring that collapse, freeze, dissociation. And I think it's useful to see how that thermostat can change, and then how we perceive threats or how we perceive our situation today will sometimes reflect what we learnt in that time. So for many people, they can continue to respond with the same activation in their nervous system that they did when there was a traumatic stress. And you can imagine if you were living in a house that, the temperature was up too high, you might have things go wrong, like where the hardwood floors have damage, and you're, looking at fixing those things. And so the maintenance projects, like painting the house, taking care of, like the windows or the locks or things like that, get put off. And so if you were to move into the too cold state, it might be like the house becomes wet and damp and the roof starts leaking. So you've got to deal with those immediate emergencies, and then the maintenance projects don't get dealt with. And so this is a little bit like what happens in our body as well, where we go into more of a survival mode. And so those long-term projects, or the way our body would look after us, systems can go out of balance. And that's what can lead to some of the chronic health issues that we see from nervous system dysregulation.
Yeah. You kind of touched on it there, this predictive ability. Are there different specific parts of the nervous system that are more engaged in that process of predicting, whether rightly or wrongly predicting what's happening for us?
It's really interesting because, we think of our brain, and it would be so nice, wouldn't it, if it optimized for happiness and optimized for rational thinking. But unfortunately, it rationalizes us for survival. And so what we can see is that the communication from the vagus nerve, it's sending bodily signals up. And we can think of the brain a little bit like sitting in the dark, and it doesn't really know what's happening clearly down in the body. It's relying on these sensory inputs from the vagus nerve, but other systems too. And so the information that comes to the lower centers in the brain, what we could call collectively the survival brain, that actually has really important information around the threat that we're under. And there's a particular part of the brain called the amygdala there, which is like the smoke detector. Now, the amygdala and what we call the frontal cortex, there are connections there between the two. But when we're really stressed, we find that we can actually have an interruption of those connections. And this is why we tend to move into our survival responses first. And then, we might react first, and then later the rational brain goes, oh, hang on a minute. And that's because those parts of the brain are a little bit quicker. And so what we learn becomes the prediction that our brain and our body will make as to what will happen again. And so there's a big part where we need to relearn a corrective experience so that they can learn, oh, actually, I can cope under stress. Oh, I'm not in this, I don't need to respond with all of this stress activation. And that's the beauty of this work, is that we can relearn ways to respond that match what's happening today.
Yeah. And I'm wondering about if you have a lack of sensitivity or a lack of sensation in your body. So are these signals always traveling up and you're not aware of it? Or can you actually lose do the signals themselves actually become weaker?
This is such a good question. I really love this topic. So we call this sensory system where we're tuning into our bodily signals or reading them. We call it interoception, and it's because we're reading internal bodily signals. Now, some of those we will be aware of. Like if you power walk up a hill, you start to feel your heart pounding, and you can feel that happening, but you might not recognize changes in blood sugar levels, but the body is sending messages up to the brain. Like a really simple example is if you're thirsty, you feel that signal and then you have a drink, the signal goes away. And this is really what the process of that homeostasis or maintaining balance is all about. So when it comes to chronic and traumatic stress, we know that there are changes that can happen following this, where for those people who tend to shift into that too cold state and they feel shut down, collapse, they have more apathy, depression, it's been shown that it's almost like the volume is turned down on these bodily signals and they're too quiet. And so they may find it really hard to read these cues. And it's the opposite for people who tend to be more hypervigilant, and they might find it that they do notice the cues, but the cues send to an area in the brain called the insula, which is reading those cues. And it immediately sends a message to that amygdala we spoke about that something bad's going to happen. So people who are anxious tend to actually feel more sensitive to the cues, but they almost read them incorrectly. And I think that can be really challenging for people, but it's learning to get the volume right, so that they're not too quiet, they're not too loud. But we can play an active role in doing that, so that we can really tune into bodily signals and proactively manage our emotions and our bodily states. And that's really what this work's all about, So like we said with the thirst, we notice the sensation, we take an action. This is really true with what we're learning to do with nervous system work, like learning to read what state we're in so that we can get back in the driver's seat, because for many people, they feel powerless and out of control with what's happening in their nervous system.
Absolutely. Thank you. And what about co-regulation? There's a couple of questions. One is, how much does our experience of co-regulating as infants have on our ability to regulate as adults? And the other question is, to what extent do we impact one another's states? And in relationships, can one person become a regulator for two people?
Yes, it's really interesting. I'm very much in this state with my daughter, who is just turned 15 months. And so being a co-regulator is very much a part of my life right now. But it's interesting because babies aren't born with this ability to self-regulate. They really need to harness a parent's nervous system to bring themselves back or to experience regulation. And this is for parents, it's not always easy, and it's like getting up many times a night sometimes to do that. But through the voice, like prosody, where we have this sing-songy voice that we automatically use, that is for babies something that changes their heart rate. It's obviously very soothing for them. Touch, being held tightly. And what's been shown as well is there is this physiological synchronization that will happen between a parent and a baby. It's their heartbeats sync. They meet up and they beat at the same rhythm. And so what's happening every time that soothing happens and that regulation happens is it's actually shaping key areas in the brain. And we could say that there are neurological expectations for babies. Now, what that would mean is that a baby comes in expecting that to happen, to have healthy development of the brain, but also the vagus nerve. So that branch that I was talking about that runs from the brainstem to the heart, that really is involved with our emotional regulation, and it has the electrical covering on it called myelin. The myelination process happens up until we're in adolescence. So it's really being laid down by that nurturing, and that's shaping how we will regulate, how we'll self-regulate for the rest of our lives. And I think there's a hyper independence in our culture around being able to handle things ourselves when they're difficult. But this is really the time that we will want to lean on others. So co-regulation is where we harness another person's nervous system to bring ourselves back, like that physiological regulation. It's really been shown to happen right throughout adulthood. There's been some really interesting research lately on like leaders of a team. They're basically saying like the leader is like the nerve center, and everybody's nervous system ends up mirroring theirs. So this emotional and stress contagion. And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to consider. Like leaders aren't just someone in a corporate world. Like this is, as I was saying, a parent. It can be, if we're looking at a teacher, it can be someone who might run a class, a health practitioner. Like leadership in companies, a lot of things where we're helping somebody else. And this is the thing our students struggle with, is that when they're working with people who are dysregulated, how hard it is to stay regulated ourselves. And so what the most beneficial thing we can start with is learning to understand our own nervous system, and when we're starting to move ourselves towards the edge of regulation. Because I'm sure everybody can relate to that time where we want to support a friend who's having a really difficult time and who might be dysregulated, but eventually we are going to shift state if they're feeling really dysregulated. And it's knowing, okay, I've reached this limit neurobiologically where I'm starting to feel dysregulated, because we can only be a co-regulator for somebody else if we're in that regulated state. So this really comes back to a lot on self-awareness and learning to speak that language of our nervous system. And it is one of the best things we can give somebody else. But it starts with recognizing what's happening inside of me, and this is how much I can give, and knowing when to say, okay, that's I'm at my limit now. And that's challenging. I used to see on some days 18 patients a day who were experiencing a lot of dysregulation. So that was a lot of learning on how to manage that all day.
Absolutely. I guess as well, it can be seen as information. If you have your own awareness of how your own system usually operates, if you start to feel dysregulated with someone else, if you accept that your nervous systems are affecting each other, you can take it as information about how the other person might be.
Exactly. And I think that's like this relational aspect of the nervous system is really fascinating, because for so long, we might be thinking, well, how I feel is happening inside me. How could it be related to this other person? But when we look at the vagus nerve, the branch that runs from the heart up to the face, there is a social engagement system that changes depending on the pitch of somebody else's voice, the expression on their face, and how they're listening, and gestures. So a lot of that has to do with that threat detection system that we were talking about in the lower centers of the brain. And so the beauty of it is we can quickly move back towards regulation with somebody else who's regulated. But then on the flip side, we can also become dysregulated by other people. And yeah, it's just that information and awareness that's so important.
Thank you. And because your background as a physio, I've got a few kind of, physiological questions.
Sure.
Explain a bit about what the fascia is and what role that plays in the nervous system.
Yes, for sure. So this is like our deep connective tissue, and we can have superficial fascia. So if anyone's looked at like an anatomy book and seen in the lower back, there's like a white diamond shape. That's our thoracolumbar fascia, and that's more closer to the surface of the skin. But then we have deeper parts of our fascia that wrap around our organs. And it's one of the biggest sensory organs in the body. Like, it's very rich in nerve endings. And, you know, a lot of the research is only coming out recently around its role, but basically it's sending a lot of what we would call bottom-up information to the brain. And so the brain really relies on this to understand how we are and that position of our body, or where we are in space, and our sense of proprioception. Now, we talked about interoception being the internal signals, but proprioception is related a lot to the joint position we're in. And we can see that by using pressure of the body, it provides this sense of containment. So when the volume is too loud or too high, sorry, I should say too loud or too low, we can use proprioceptive information to send messages up to the brain, to that insula, and also other important regions in the cortex, to let the brain know that things are okay. And so when we're really stressed and we think about trying to use, say, our thoughts and our narratives to change what's happening, you know, we might say, it's not that bad, or Kate's got it so much worse, or we, you know, cut off from what we're experiencing. We're not really leaning into the part of the brain where stress and trauma take place. So the fascia is another tool to connect with our body, so that the body sends a message to that survival brain that everything's okay. And that in itself brings regulation. So there's research that shows that the vagus nerve can come back online through using proprioception. Now, it's a little bit more complex, where it's not like we can say the fascia is directly impacting the vagus nerve, you know, in terms of connections. But what we're doing is changing the feedback loop of the information sent from the body up to the brain, and then how the vagus nerve changes our physiology coming back down. So it's good to think of this information of the brain body system like this continual feedback loop. And that's really what some reset is about, is being able to tap into those different sensory systems. And I do speak a lot about the vagus nerve, but also our other sensory systems like our proprioceptors as well, because they are definitely a big part of the autonomic nervous system.
And then there's certain parts of our body that are more likely to get locked up in situations of kind of chronic stress or trauma.
Yeah. So what we can see for people is two responses, but similar to what we've touched on. And in that sympathetic or too hot state, we might experience more of like an increase in our tone or muscle tone in the body, where it's more bracing, and particularly in the sides of the ribs there. And so it's almost like it's locking down the side and we brace, and there can be a lot of tension that creeps in the lower back, like around the spine there, in that fascia I was talking about, the thoracolumbar fascia. And so working in that area can help with the muscles that connect between the ribs and the pelvis as well, and that can assist with breathing. So we can change the messages being sent up to the brain, but we're also indirectly changing our breathing. For people who tend to move into dorsal vagal collapse, you know, that sense of collapse through the body and dissociation, by using input to the fascia, it can actually send messages up to the brain that help to keep those important regions that sense where the body is online, that tend to go offline when we move into dissociation. And so if we feel ourselves like, oh, I'm starting to shut down, I'm cutting off from my body, and we use a way to connect to those areas of our body, what that will do is keep that integration of information between the body and the brain. And so we don't have to move right down into that, like spiraling down into shame. A lot of people say that this is like being alone in a room by themselves, you know, that feeling of collapse. I can't feel connected to my body. So we're trying to bring again that volume switch right back to the correct level, so that we integrate the information between the body and brain, which is what modulates our stress response.
And what are some of the ways we can do that? I mean, is movement one of the ways to keep that feedback loop open?
Yeah, movement is a fantastic resource, but if we're looking at like fascia specifically, I've put some resources in there that can be using touch with another person, but also things we can do on our own using like fascia balls or tennis balls is another really good way to do it. But we can definitely use movement as a way where if we're looking at proprioception specifically, isometric movement where we might meet our resistance with our two hands and not actually move, but the receptors from our joints are feeding back to the brain, okay, this is where my body is. And so if we think of like that the survival responses are taking us out of our body, we're coming back into our body, and that's very regulating.
Thank you. And you talk a bit in the book about bioplasticity, and I feel like lots of people have heard about neuroplasticity, but can you tell us?
Yeah. Yes, I would love to. So, if we look at neuroplasticity as how neurons change, which is something that we definitely know can happen through what we learn. So, I touched on this before when we talked about, if we're looking at, say, we want to learn a new language, we can't just watch tutorials on it. We actually need to go through the process. If we want to play the piano, we can't just read the music. We actually need to practice. And what will happen is that we have changes in auditory areas in our brain, and we'll even have changes in our fingers as to detect where we put them. Like guitarists and violinists, they've changed areas in their brain that detect the position of their fingers, but the sensory ability of their fingers to detect things. But what we know that happens is that not just neurons or nerves change. So for people who play the guitar, for instance, they might also recognize, there's a callus forming on the skin, which is a really simple example of this. But we see changes right throughout, which is why we want to use the word bioplasticity. So with nervous system work, we think it's just the nerves that change, but we know that also the immune system can change from this. So inflammation can change. We know that for people, their digestive health can improve because if we're in survival mode, the blood flow changes. Instead of going to our digestive system, it's going out to our arms and our legs. And that means that motility stops, like movement of food through the gut stops working as well. And so if we can bring ourselves back to spending more time in the state of regulation and we teach our nervous system a new way to respond and build vagal tone, or the vagus nerve works better, we can say that it's bioplasticity because it's benefiting so many different systems of our body, as well as neurons.
And so last couple of questions, how would you encourage people to get started on mapping out their nervous system and getting to know themselves in that way?
Well, it's such a good question. And this is the foundation for it all, because if we can't work out what state we're in to begin with, it makes it challenging on what resource we use. But the first thing is to recognize the sensations and the emotions we feel from each state, as well as the way we hold our body, which we've talked about. So if we're looking at that sympathetic state and we're bracing, we might notice, my shoulders are up. I'm clenching my jaw. And that's a way to see that proprioception change, or the way our body changes, but also learning to understand the bodily signals. So when we look at our bodily signals, it might be, well, my heart's beating really fast. Well, that could be excitement. That could be anger. That could be anxiety. So then if we look at, well, it's two or more bodily signals that make up an emotion. So for instance, if it's anger, it might be the pounding heart, but it could be the tension in my jaw and my hands are in fists. And that lets me know that that's emotion, that emotion is anger. And so we want to then be able to use that information to build the picture of, I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling this mobilization in my nervous system. I'm hearing the stories around this state that something else is going to go wrong or the other shoe's going to drop. And that then builds this picture of, oh, I recognize what state I'm in. And for a lot of people, when they recognize that, that in itself, it makes us feel like we're less out of control. And for many of our students, that's what helps begin to shift them back into regulation themselves. And so we really want to do this in an experiential way. So we might bring to mind a time recently where we did experience some stress, nothing traumatic, and just noticing what's happening in my body. How does my body want to hold itself? What are those stories and thoughts like? And actually mapping that out so we can see it. And, it will change. We'll have different things for different experiences, but it helps us learn this new language. It's like the process of learning to speak Spanish or learning to do something new. As we repeat it, it becomes much easier and faster for us to recognize that.
And can you give us a couple of simple things that people might be able to do at home? What they call vagal toning exercises, I guess, but just a few things that are really easy to adopt.
Yeah, sure. So we've spoken about the co-regulation factor. I think for many people who are dysregulated, that's, one of the primary things that will really help. But play, the state of play, where we allow this mobilizing energy to come into our system, but we can keep it in check with the vagus nerve, is a great way to train our nervous system. It's a little bit like going to the gym. So for some people, if we think about play, it sounds a little bit childish, but we're talking about what allows this mobilizing energy to come into your system where you feel a sense that it might be pushing you. It's not that we want to be comfortable and calm with this all the time, but it's not going to push you into fight or flight. And so for a lot of people, that can be something like doing something with their child. It can be with a friend. And that mobilizing energy that comes in and then we recover from is a way that we stretch our nervous system. A lot of the stuff we've talked about with being able to connect to the body as well, like the proprioception we spoke about with the isometric contractions, is a really helpful way. And that's been shown to bring the vagus nerve online in times of stress as well. But they would be the main things to get started with. We can also look at movement, like you said as well. It's not necessarily about, putting on our heart rate monitor and saying, well, I'm going to go for 3 kilometers for this long and making it really cognitive. It's like, what do we notice happening in our body with exercise and movement? That can be a really beautiful way to bring ourselves back to regulation if we tend to experience a lot of that mobilization.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's been fascinating to talk to you. And
You're welcome.
we'll do really well. It's brilliant.
Thank you so much.